Continuing from parts 1 and 2 of this series, in this video I will explore how the Bonnie situation, the final episode of Pulp Fiction, is also part of a coded allegory that narrativises American history. Through symbolic representation, this episode portrays the process of mass media whitewashing America's history of genocide and racialised violence. In the Bonnie situation, we see how the social, cultural and intellectual history of America has been shaped by the nation's violent legacy and the attempt to sanitise that legacy. And also we see how the colonial civilising mission of California's Franciscan orders persists through the cultural production of the Hollywood studios. This part of the film characterises American media as a missionary process. Wolf is the personification of Hollywood, and he assists in the transformation of the two main characters. In the process of cleaning the car and themselves, Vincent and Jules are essentially converted in ways that parallel historical changes, and the episode interconnects those changes to form a textured narrative from a fresh perspective. Vincent symbolically transforms from a post-Puritan New Englander, covered in the blood of genocide, into a chilled-out hippie. Jules symbolically transforms from a docile pre-civil rights era African American into a militant African American of the civil rights era, and then finally into a pacified post-civil rights era African American. Tarantino's character, Jimmy, symbolises the Jim Crowe South, and he must participate in the transformation process taking place in order to avoid an even greater confrontation. The prospect of his wife, who is black, witnessing Marvin's body upon arrival is symbolic of the prospect of America's black population becoming conscious of the historical legacy of slavery and then becoming enraged in response, a spectre that has haunted white America throughout the centuries. Tarantino is drawing a parallel between how the Christian religion was used to manipulate native people in the Spanish colony of California, and how the modern American storytelling industry, based in Hollywood, is used to manipulate modern populations. In both cases, this manipulation process would be undertaken as a nation-building exercise, and this nation-building exercise would mask the reality of elite coercion and military force in both 20th century Hollywood and in Spain's California. As I discussed in part 2 of this series, Jules and Vincent's theological discussion about surviving the shooting unscathed represents a divergence in thought that took place historically in America and that fractured both puritanical New England and the emerging frontier. Jules, with his enthusiasm for a supernatural explanation, represents the attitude of the Second Great Awakening, while Vincent, with his commitment to rationalism and empiricism, represents the American Enlightenment. As I explained in part 2, this divergence in thought is made to appear absurd and hypocritical because it took place following the bloody genocide of the Native Americans, which is represented by the bloody murder of the Big Kahuna Guys, who are coded as Native Americans. Their murder is accompanied by a biblical passage symbolising the hypocrisy underpinning the violent religiosity that shaped the colonisation of the New World.
Marvin, what do you make of all this?
Man, I don't even have an opinion.
Well, you gotta have an opinion. I mean, do you think that God came down from heaven and stopped?
Marvin's blood in the car represents America's stained history of genocide and slavery, and the ancestral guilt that has endured in later generations. The attempt to clean up Marvin's bloody remains and the effect of this process on Jules, Vincent and Jimmy is a coded chronological narrativization of America's history of racial tension and the superficial reconciliation that emerged in the aftermath of that history. Before analysing the scene, I want to draw attention to the fact that the chapter ends in Hawthorne's Grill. This is a reference to Nathaniel Hawthorne, an author whose work centres on the psychological effect of ancestral guilt related to the genocide of Native Americans.
That was 180 years ago, Jeffrey. There's cities there now, thousands of people.
Additionally, as I have explained in parts 1 and 2, the fiction of Washington Irving is used to inform the coded narrative of the entire film. Irving is referenced through the mention of Grandpa Irving in the first scene.
You've got Grandpa Irving sitting behind the counter with a fucking Magnum in his hand.
Irving presents a similar historical perspective to Hawthorne and was a major literary influence on the younger Hawthorne. Marvin's blood in the car represents a quintessentially New Englander ancestral guilt surrounding the genocide of the Native American population that Hawthorne explores in his historical fiction. As Tarantino illustrates, this New Englander guilt was transplanted in California. Let's have a look at some of the cinematic elements that construct the coded narrative. They discuss the show Cops immediately before Marvin is killed.
You ever seen that show, Cops?
This barbaric TV show, which typically involves white policemen brutalizing black criminals, is the most clear representation of white supremacist violence on television from the time that the film was made. The show Cops illustrates quite plainly that the continent that Columbus arrived on in 1492 has changed only superficially, and that the continuation of white supremacy is maintained by media. Although we use different terminology now, in the nomenclature of the Spanish missionaries of the 16th century, Cops depicts a sort of civilising mission wherein wild savages are tamed by white conquerors.
You ever seen that show, Cops? I was watching it one time and there was this cop on, he was talking about...
Referencing the show Cops thematically associates modern mass media with the historical Spanish missionaries in other ways too. The show Cops, as a cultural artifact, demonstrates that mass media is still used to manipulate populations in order to benefit the avaricious elites, just as Christianity was used to justify the conquistadors' genocide and to mentally colonize the native people whose gold and land was stolen. Essentially, the representation of black people in Cops serves to keep white Americans scared of African Americans in order to justify their brutalization, and also it serves to deceive African Americans into thinking that they are a savage people in need of civilising by supposedly superior white men.
Shut up!
The theme of the coded narrative of the Bonnie situation is that America's bloody racial history has a connection to cultural production, and this perspective is signalled to by talking about Cops in the moment immediately preceding Marvin's death, which is the initiating incident of the episode.
What you doing?
I'm calling my partner in Toluca Lake.
Jimmy's house is on Toluca Lane. Toluca was one of the first places in Mexico where the Spanish missionary colonization process was established, following the arrival of Spaniards in modern Mexico in 1519. The leader of the indigenous people of what is now the Toluca Valley, a man called Tochcoyotzin, was one of the first New World rulers to convert to Christianity and ally himself with Cortes against the Aztecs. The pattern of the Spanish missionary system that would come to define the early colonial history of Alta California took root in areas that included Toluca. In the Catholic missions of this region, they discovered that the best way to colonize people is through gradually integrating your own message into the previously existing culture and mythology of the colonized society in order to pave the way for military conquest. Hollywood studios would perfect this approach in the 20th century. The coalescence of cultural production and military power is further associated with modern mass media by the mention of Burbank, an area of Los Angeles.
Where's Toluca Lake?
It's just over the hill here, over by Burbank Studios.
As well as being the media capital of America, Burbank also hosted Lockheed Martin and other military manufacturers throughout the 20th century. Just like how the Spanish missions were closely linked to the conquistadors' colonization, Hollywood is closely linked to the modern American military's imperialism. This connection is gestured towards by the mention of Burbank.
Man, because I ain't got no other partners in 818.
Jules mentions area code 818. The first Viking raids on the Byzantine Empire began in the year 818 AD. Over time, these raiders would convert to Christianity, assimilate with the local culture, and eventually become the Varangian Guard, who served as the emperor's most loyal servants. The number 818 connotes the beginning of a different historical process of Christianization and cultural assimilation that took place much earlier. Toluca Lane, Burbank, and area code 818 are mentioned in rapid succession. They arrive at Jimmy's house, where the cinematic language used to convey the coded narrative becomes more subtle and more subjective. The opening shot shows Jules washing his hands, which signifies that the cleaning process has begun. This cleaning process represents the national project of sanitizing America's bloody history in order to create a passable national identity that downplays the record of violence, assuages ancestral guilt, and presents an America more in line with its own purported values. The difficulty in removing the blood represents the pervasiveness of ancestral guilt in the white Yankee consciousness. It comes off the hands of Jules, but not Vincent, the white character. Like Lady Macbeth failing to wash King Duncan's blood from her hands in her own guilty imagination, the northeastern American would prove unable to scrub the blood of genocide from its guilty conscience. Hawthorne, as a figure, epitomizes this intergenerational Macbethian guilt that all the perfumes of Arabia could not sweeten. Jules, as he washes his hands, says,
"We gotta be real fucking delicate with this Jimmy situation."
Jimmy represents the Jim Crowe South. Jimmy's anger symbolises the Southern reaction to the various attempts made to transform America into a more racially equal country, and to the cultural recognition of white wrongdoing that the national whitewashing process would entail. In these moments, Jules becomes the embodiment of the formerly enslaved African American population, rather than the personification of religious revivalism. As he's washing his hands, we can see a gold chain on Jules's wrist that possibly connotes the fact that African Americans are a manumitted slave population. Also, Jules does not get the towel bloody, only Vincent does because he is white and therefore more ancestrally culpable for the genocidal violence that Marvin's blood represents. Jules warns Vincent about coming to another man's house and telling him what to do. This warning mirrors the states' rights argument that has historically been used to justify the continuation of Southern institutions such as slavery and segregation.
You don't come to your friend's house and start telling him what's what.
Vincent asks that Jimmy not be abusive, which is hypocritical because he has just killed 2 people. This is typical of the discourse surrounding Northern attitudes towards the South, whom they tend to cast as the sole perpetrators of America's original sins of slavery, genocide, and even violence against women, forgetting their own history. Throughout this episode, there are moments that appear similar to an advert for consumer products, like coffee or soap, which connect the scene to superficial mass media and also illustrate the underlying violence beneath modern American media and the hypocrisy of that juxtaposition. The hand-washing process is like an advert for lava soap. Jules and Wolf's reaction to the coffee are both reminiscent of a coffee advert. Additionally, as a product, coffee itself is deeply connected to plantation slavery, and as a modern industry, coffee production represents a continuation of this system. Jules compares the coffee to Taster's Choice, a Nescafé product. Nescafé specifically played a role in industrializing, repackaging, and whitewashing the legacy of the coffee plantation. The coded narrative of this episode is about the historical process of repackaging oppressive systems that have become recognized as barbaric. Jimmy, a personification of the Jim Crowe South, is racially abusive to Jules, a black man who acts in a way that is uncharacteristically subservient. Jimmy is wearing a red robe, like a senior member of the Ku Klux Klan, and his mug has stripes that are vaguely similar in design to the insignia of the Confederacy. Vincent's mug, in contrast, is blue, the colour of the Union Army. The smiling globe on Jimmy's t-shirt perhaps symbolises the global perception that the South is a friendly, hospitable place despite its outward racism. On the wall behind Jimmy, there is a clock and a gold-rimmed mirror. The gold watch is established in the film as a symbol of Southern pride for Butch. Here we can see that the components of that symbol are divided. Below the surface of this scene, Southern pride has been broken because the South is being forced to participate in the sanitization process. If you look at Jimmy's right hand, he seems to be holding a gold chain that might be for a pocket watch, but without anything attached to it. Finally, Jimmy talking about getting divorced connotes succession from the Union. Both involve separation.
Trial separation. I'm gonna get fucking divorced.
Also, the fact that Jimmy remains in his pajamas throughout the episode perhaps symbolises the South's relative lack of industrialisation historically. The socio-economic transformations of the Industrial Revolution, which was a largely northern affair in the United States, involved a process of intense regimentation and mobilisation. Jimmy, who seems to have been having a fairly chilled out morning without any time pressure or place to be, personifies the South's lack of industrialisation. The imagined scenario of Jimmy's black wife returning home and seeing Marvin's body is a metaphor for the potentially explosive outcome of African Americans en masse becoming conscious of how horrific slavery was, and how its legacy shapes their condition in contemporary America. When Jules says, "Ain't no telling what she's liable to do," he parallels the fear of a black backlash that would potentially result from a widespread awareness of historical truth.
Tell him I said, ow, gotcha.
Jules says, "That's Kool and the gang."
That's Cool in the gang. You know, we don't want to fuck your shit up.
Kool and the gang, as a cultural phenomenon, has a thematic connection to the historical narrative coded into the scene because the band represents an example of black music that was not only popular with white audiences, but that was reformulated in order to appeal to a mainstream white audience. In other words, Kool and the Gang is a culturally sanitized product that bridged racial divides, and the Bonnie situation is a satire of the historical process of cultural sanitization that was undertaken to cleanse America's legacy of racialized violence. Kool and the Gang originally started as an avant-garde jazz combo called the Jazziacs, but the band was recast as a more palatable funk band by record labels, eventually becoming a pop group. Therefore, in the wider context of the coded narrative, Kool and the Gang connotes the role of media in assimilating non-white culture and in ameliorating the racial tensions that came to a head in the mid-20th century. Throughout the kitchen there are items and appliances associated with cleaning that one would naturally find in a kitchen. In the context of the other elements of the coded narrative, we can interpret the clean plates, the washing machine, and the cleaning spray behind the sink as readable aspects of the mise-en-scène. The shots of Marcellus Wallace when he is on the phone evoke the segregation of the pre-civil rights era southern states. The interracial kiss between Marcellus and Mia is excluded through editing, even though Pulp Fiction can hardly be considered a prudish film. At one point in time, miscegenation was illegal in the South and on TV. Additionally, Mia, who is white, swims in the pool, whereas her husband Marcellus, who is black, remains outside of the pool. Swimming pools were segregated before the civil rights movement. Also, they're having breakfast, and segregated breakfast counters were a flashpoint of hostility during the civil rights movement. There is an irony in this visual language because Marcellus appears to have made it. Marcellus is a powerful figure who lives in opulence, and he is married to a white woman. However, the minute details of what is happening are used to reference the subjugation of black men in America, even though he represents the antithesis of this. You can just about see a grapefruit in the frame. Grapefruits are connected to slavery because the crossbreeding of citrus fruits that led to their development took place in Barbados in the 17th century, presumably on a slave plantation. The presence of grapefruit, when viewed critically through a historicistic lens, gestures towards how the legacy of slavery is present in the daily lives of modern Americans. Other items on the table that are visible in the wider shot, like sugar, pepper, tomatoes, oranges, tobacco, and obviously the cotton of his napkin, also connect the modern American breakfast table to the legacy of colonialism. They even have porcelain plates. Just to clarify, although there was no Jim Crow in the North, anti-miscegenation and segregation were maintained without the same legal codes that governed the South, and in some instances we can see that this bigotry persists into the modern day. Perhaps the black kettle in the frame here is alluding to the hypocrisy of northern states calling southern states racist. It is like the pot calling the kettle black. Additionally, Marcellus Wallace is eating an omelette, which evokes the phrase, "You have to break a few eggs to make an omelette." This phrase relates to the coded narrative of the scene because the historical process of transforming America's white supremacist culture would involve violent, dramatic change and a disturbance of long-standing institutions and attitudes. This expression has its origins in the royalist counter-revolution that followed the French Revolution, and so the phrase connotes a counter-revolution equivalent to the historical transformation being allegorized in the Bonnie situation. Also, the wallpaper in different rooms in the house have butterflies and flowers on them, suggesting that what's happening in the coded narrative is a renewal or rebirth, similar to the emergence of a butterfly from a cocoon or a flower blooming. Wolfe personifies Hollywood, and his role in overseeing the cleaning of the car parallels the role that Hollywood played in smoothing out America's tensions as the young nation sought to sanitize itself and cover up its bloody history. Wolfe is dressed like an old Hollywood star, and his California license plate is shown prominently upon arrival, and he is played by a famous Hollywood actor, Harvey Keitel. Later on, the pattern of Wolfe's coffee mug resembles a reel of film, which obviously connotes Hollywood and the filmmaking industry. Wolfe's first line is she the hysterical type?
Is she the hysterical type?
This language evokes the trope of a classic Hollywood star slapping his manic female counterpart and telling her to pull herself together. The hotel room that's been turned into a casino or some kind of auction where Wolfe is beforehand connotes that Hollywood is associated with the tyrannical elite because it is a very luxurious setting and there is an abundance of the colour purple, which symbolises a long-standing old-world tyranny, as I explained in part 1. Being described on the phone by Marcellus Wallace as the cavalry also signals to us that Wolfe is the defender of the existing power structure.
What I want to hear from your ass is, you ain't got no problem, Jules. I'm on the motherfucker. Go back in there, chill them out, and wait for the cavalry, which should be coming directly.
Additionally, the hotel room is filled with glamorous young women conversing flirtatiously with older men, which is potentially a comment on the darker side of Hollywood. As we know, powerful producers and directors in Hollywood often exploit young women. The film was produced by Harvey Weinstein's company. When Wolfe is noting down the details of the situation, we can see the number 1265 on his notepad. The Westminster Parliament was established in 1265 AD. This number therefore connotes the idea of the elite cynically relinquishing some power to some people in order to preserve central power over a troubled realm. The fact that the race of both Jules and Vincent is spelled out suggests that the historical inclusion of black people into American political life is indeed the transfer of power that is being connected to the establishment of the Westminster Parliament, which included the powerful burgesses of medieval England into the affairs of state. In both cases, however, true power would remain in the hands of the privileged elites.
2 civilized senators.
Wolfe writes down, "One body, no head." this reflects Hollywood's objectives, according to the satire being presented in the coded narrative. The desired result is a unified nation that acts as one body, and for that nation to lack intellect and reasoning, with no head signifying brainlessness. Wolf's car appears barreling down the street 9 minutes and 37 seconds later, after announcing that he will be there in 10 minutes. In 937 AD, the Battle of Bronnenburh was fought in Britain when Anglo-Saxons defended themselves against a coalition of invading armies. This battle was pivotal in forging English identity because it was marked as the first instance when the fragmented kingdoms of modern England united in order to defeat an outside enemy. Wolfe's role in the cleaning process symbolises Hollywood's role in uniting America under a common national mythology and identity. Upon arrival, Wolfe's car obscures a Volkswagen truck. This manufacturer is obviously synonymous with Nazism. On the one hand, Hollywood was historically an opponent of Nazism, and it was deployed by the government to persuade Americans to support the war. However, on the other hand, Hollywood obscured the fact that the US had a connection to the Third Reich before and after the war. So perhaps Wolfe covering up the Volkswagen alludes to Hollywood's role in obscuring that historical inconvenience in the popular imagination, rather than to its propaganda role in galvanizing the American population in preparation for war against the Nazis. It is an ambiguous visual metaphor reflecting a historical paradox. Additionally, we can see immediately that Wolfe is associated with precision and time. Acura, the name of his car, is etymologically connected to accuracy, and he arrives in 10 minutes exactly. Before he leaves for Jimmy's house, he checks his Gucci watch. The history of California is associated with precise timekeeping because its development has been driven by two industries that rely on precise timekeeping, that is, the railroads and filmmaking. Also, more importantly, the California-based media is effectively the chronicler of American history through cinema. Hollywood is the record keeper and also the instrument that indicates changing times through its role in creating fads and shaping culture more generally. Timekeeping devices play an amorphous role in Pulp Fiction. Gucci also supported the fascist war effort in World War II, kitting out the Italian army. Therefore, like Volkswagen, Gucci has been whitewashed as a post-war consumer brand. Both brands have been sanitized in a similar process to the one being allegorized throughout the episode. Feel free to ignore this next point, it's just something that came up in my research. But as Wolfe arrives, there are two numbers visible. There is 4149 written on the curb, even though Jimmy lives at 1265, and 581 is at the end of his number plate. When researching for the video, I discovered that there is something called Strong's Concordance, which categorizes every word in the Bible into a numerical digit. 4149 signifies abundance and wealth, and he is clearly wealthy, as is Hollywood. And 581 signifies being rid of something, and he is there to rid them of Marvin's remains. Wolfe drives an Acura car, as I mentioned. The Acura were a highly resistant Native American tribe in modern-day Florida that were eventually assimilated, Christianized, and exterminated, despite being extremely tenacious initially in their opposition to Spanish colonization. Referencing this tribe illustrates that the voluntary subjugation methods of both the Spanish missions and the Hollywood studios can often take generations to bring a resistant people to their knees, and that this process of subjugation can often require the assistance of more coercive, violent methods. Also, the Aquera tribe was one of the first tribes in the modern United States to be chronicled by European explorers, specifically El Inca de la Vega, who shared Vincent's last name. Vega's romanticised chronicles of the Aquera people are the first examples of how storytelling played a role in the early colonisation of America, which it continues to do in the era of Hollywood and US global imperialism. The Pulp Fiction literature that lends its name to the film played a role in this colonial storytelling too. The name of the car manufacturer draws an association between indigenous genocide and colonial assimilation, while connecting the role of cultural production to that assimilation process, which is itself a process of violent ethnic cleansing. This is obviously very English of me, but there are no clouds in the sky when Wolfe arrives. This possibly mirrors the general message of optimism that classic Hollywood propagated. There is also a lamppost which is reminiscent of Singing in the Rain, given the other coding in the scene. This film is an example of classic Hollywood's optimism, which is part of the cultural myth-making theme of the coded narrative. This optimism is also signalled to by how Wolfe takes his coffee.
How do you take it?
Lots of cream, lots of sugar.
Or, in combination with this optimism, the clear sky perhaps represents the sanitisation process that the Bonnie situation is satirising. In other words, the clouds of American history are evaporated by Hollywood. In the house, Wolfe says,
"Let's get down to brass tacks, gentlemen,"
which is an Americanism. That is, that the phrase originated from within the United States, having not previously existed in the English language. The use of this uniquely American phrase reinforces the idea that Wolfe symbolises American cultural production, which adds to his characterisation as the personification of Hollywood. Hollywood would be the main driver of the project to carve out a distinct American identity. Jimmy has transformed in the presence of Wolfe, becoming infinitely more passive and well-mannered. This reflects how Hollywood transformed perceptions of the South. Early Hollywood cinema ennobled the South and presented its culture in the most favourable way, ignoring the reality of its racial violence.
Bonnie comes home at 9:30 in the a.m., is that correct?
Bonnie is expected to arrive at 9:30 a.m. In the year 930 AD, the foundation of the world's oldest recorded parliament took place in Iceland. The Althing was established to settle disputes between rival Icelandic leaders. In a similar way to how the rival local chieftains were brought together to settle disputes in Iceland, the competing nations within the fractured United States were brought together by mass media, which helped to foster a more coherent national identity. This process is being historicised through connotation in these scenes, with the different characters personifying the different regional, ethnic and cultural movers in this bumpy historical process of national reunification. Another event in 930 AD was the sack of Mecca, which I will argue thematically correlates to both an imagined black uprising that haunts the American establishment, the emergence of which is what Bonnie returning at 9:30 a.m. symbolises, and also to the actual Black Power movement that emerged in the Civil Rights era and that was suppressed. Here's a summary of what happened in Mecca in 930 AD. A messianic figure called Abu Tahir al-Janabi, claiming that one of his followers was the long-awaited Mehdi, would lead a raid of Mecca while announcing a rejection of a number of religious and political practices of the Abbasid Caliphate that he viewed as corrupt and irreligious. Appealing to the notion that all Muslims may enter, his men raided the Kaaba in Mecca, looting its treasures and attacking its pilgrims. This event caused shockwaves throughout the Islamic world and exposed the weakness of the Abbasid rulers. However, over time, the followers of Abu Tahir recognized that the Mehdi had not emerged, they killed their spiritual leader, and the rest were assimilated into the political order against whom they had rebelled. The followers of Abu Tahir al-Janabi have a remarkably similar historical role to the black radicals of the 1960s. FBI documents have revealed the establishment's fear of the emergence of what they termed a black messiah, and many of the black civil rights leaders were martyred to prevent them from leading their people into rebellion. Both episodes in history resulted in the fear-inducing rebels who rejected the corruption and hypocrisy of the system, eventually becoming a non-threat through assimilation, negotiation, and damaging internal conflict. The followers of Abu Tahir and the followers of the Black Power movement would both invoke the promise of universal equality that existed in the respective legal codes of their time to justify their cause. Black radicals even adopted Islam too. In both cases, the revolutionary violence of these small, highly mobilized groups would fail to depose the tyrannical hypocrites whom they sought to topple. Nevertheless, in both cases, the powerful were exposed as being weak amid the shockwaves of panic, which is what Hollywood, personified by Wolf, is trying to prevent in this moment of the film. Another suppressed rebellion from history is connoted in this part of the film. The name Bonnie is a reference to Bonnie Prince Charlie, the romanticised figure who led the Jacobite rebellion in 1745. Known as the Young Pretender, Bonnie Prince Charlie led the final historical attempt by Scottish Highland rebels to reinstall the former Stuart monarchy in Britain. This uprising was eventually crushed, resulting in the intensification of English control over Scotland, the end of the Jacobite cause, and the suppression of the Highlands' cultural heritage. For example, the wearing of kilts was banned shortly afterwards. Bonnie is called Bonnie in order to connect the concept of a black uprising and the historical Black Power movement, plus the suppression of both, with the Jacobite rebellion in 1745 plus its suppression by the English. African Americans, existing as a nation within a nation much like the Scots, would be violently repressed and culturally manipulated in a similar way to the Stuart-supporting Jacobites of 18th century Scotland, following their failed uprising in the middle of the 20th century. The fact that Marcellus Wallace shares a last name with William Wallace also associates blackness with Scottishness. There is a shot from inside the car. It's as if the window is like a film screen and everybody but Jimmy is within the frame. This is a visual metaphor for how the racism of the Jim Crowe South was excluded from the Hollywood portrayal of modern America. When Jimmy is eventually framed, he is being hospitable rather than racially abusive.
How do you take it?
As I mentioned before, there are moments that are presented as though they are product placements for consumer products. This entire cleaning up process is staged almost like an advert for a particular brand of coffee, which is an extremely rich satirical comment. Media is used to prevent the formerly enslaved black population from recognizing their historic condition and also to sell coffee. The fact that mass media is the method used to essentially conduct mass brainwashing on a population that is ready to explode with racial violence, and also the method used to sell household products, often through an equally elaborate myth-making process, is as strange a situation as a man like Wolf taking a moment to savour the taste of his coffee in this gory, high-pressure situation. Wolf tells them to remove all of the brain from the floor of the car. This reflects the dual role of modern American media in both assuaging ancestral guilt that plagues the American mind and in reducing the intellectual capacity of the population. Remember, Hollywood's role is defined by the note that Wolf writes: "One body, no head." Wolf tells them to tackle the pools of blood that have collected in the car, which translate to Hollywood whitewashing or sanitizing the most gruesome aspects of American history and culture, so that, unless examined carefully, there appears to be no bloody legacy plaguing the conscience of Americans or affecting the global perception of America. America, by the end of this cultural sanitization process that is being connoted, like the car, would not appear to have a history defined by bloodshed and genocide. That is, at a glance at least.
No whites. Can't use them.
Jimmy is told not to bring his white robes. This should require no explanation. The Ku Klux Klan wear white robes. Jimmy being told by Wolf to bring all of his robes except his white ones represents the South being told that it must abandon its most visibly racist idiosyncrasies, and Wolf performs Hollywood's role in communicating these outwardly imposed changes to a Southern audience. When Vincent asks for Wolf to say please, Wolf explicitly states that he is there to tell them what to do. Hollywood, by producing fads and shaping culture, effectively tells people what to do. Wolf saying, "Pretty please with sugar on top, clean the fucking car," encapsulates the paradoxical combination of coercion and suggestion that underpins both American cultural hegemony and Spanish missionary colonization. Vincent at this stage is exhibiting the hostility of white Americans outside of the South when they were expected to participate in the historical process being satirized in the coded narrative. Around the time when mass media was emerging in the US, the Northern Yankees, having distanced themselves from the ancestral guilt of earlier generations, barely tolerated the top-down attempts to improve the station of formerly enslaved African Americans. Additionally, through immigration, by the 20th century, a large portion of the white population of the northern states had no ancestral link to the original sins of America's foundation. Even though they undoubtedly benefited from slavery and the genocide of the indigenous people to varying degrees, these Irishmen, Italians and so forth were less mentally occupied by ancestral guilt than the direct descendants of early colonialists, epitomised by figures such as Nathaniel Hawthorne. Wolf is on the phone in Jimmy's bedroom and there is a blue cat on the chair. There is also a blue cat on the shelf in the kitchen. This is a reference to a novel called The Blue Cat of Castletown by Catherine Koblenz, that I will summarise. This novel, set in Vermont in the 1830s, is about a blue kitten who teaches craftsmen the Song of the River, which is a melody produced by the river that only the cat can hear. The blue kitten, by performing the river song to them, inspires the craftsmen to avoid making cheap, mass-produced items for profit, but instead to focus on creating beautiful things. The kitten inspires a pewterer to fashion a beautiful teapot. In the Bonnie situation, an ornate teapot appears on the counter to reinforce the association with this novel. It hadn't been there before. The blue kitten is eventually captured by Aruna Hyde, who is a wealthy local industrialist, and taken to live with him at Mansion House, where the kitten is fed an overindulgent diet of cream and salmon, eventually forgetting the river song in the process. The blue kitten escapes after discovering that Hyde has his own evil song, a song of industry and progress that challenges the message of self-actualization that the river song conveys. Hyde's song eventually hypnotizes the town, sending them into a sort of trance where they become convinced to produce cheap, mass-produced wares. However, a little girl inspired by the blue kitten's river song produces a handmade quilt depicting the various cats that she's encountered, including the eponymous blue cat, and this inspires the town to reject mass-produced items in preference of meaningful crafts. This story relates to Hollywood because cultural production, represented by the Song of the River and Hyde's song, is used to inspire people both positively and negatively, affecting their outlook and behaviour as they witness historical changes around them. However, it is ambiguous which song Wolf, as a personification of Hollywood, represents. I cannot ascertain what song Hollywood is supposed to be singing in the coded allegory of the scene. On the one hand, it could be the river song because Hollywood has been a vehicle for disseminating ideas like freedom, compassion, and humanity. On the other hand, Hollywood has paradoxically been a vehicle for increasing selfishness, materialism, and ignorance. Therefore, Hollywood is potentially being associated with Hyde's song that encourages industrial mass production. Like Castletown in the novel, Hollywood is a battleground for these two competing songs.
Mr. Wolf, you gotta understand something.
Winston. Jimmy, please. Winston.
Okay. You gotta understand something now, Winston. No, thank you.
Before Wolf talks to Jimmy privately, the combination of his actions and dialogue present a subliminal advert for Winston cigarettes. More so than the other moments that seem like adverts, this one demonstrates how sinister and how multifaceted the cultural suggestion methods of mass media can be.
No, thank you.
The quasi-advert that is presented in this case is not only subliminal, but it is also for a highly deadly and addictive product. American media, while whitewashing the nation's history, also tried to manipulate people, including children, to get them hooked on Winston and other cigarette brands. When Wolf convinces Jimmy to relinquish his best linen, a family heirloom, in exchange for an oak bedroom, this represents the pressure that the South came under to evolve from the cultural framework that defined both the antebellum and Jim Crow period. The bargaining process taking place in the surface level plot of the scene parallels the historical defanging of the American South, and Wolf represents the role of Hollywood in this bargaining process. In this moment, there are a number of connotations in the dialogue and mise-en-scène that connect this post-civil rights era bargaining process to the defeat and surrender of the Confederacy in the American Civil War.
This is our best linen here, and it's,
The Confederacy surrendered with a linen cloth. The Confederate flag of truce, a simple linen cloth, was flown to signal the final surrender of Robert E. Lee to the Union Army.
You an oak man?
Wolf offers to buy Jimmy an oak bedroom set. Oak, in the context of Southern racial politics, evokes the history of lynching in that region. Oak trees were the sites of many lynchings in the Jim Crow era. Often they were the oak trees on former plantations that had been used for hanging slaves in earlier generations. Jimmy is reluctant to part with the bedsheets. He has a sentimental attachment to the linen because it was a wedding present from his Uncle Conrad and Aunt Ginny. Ginny is short for Virginia. Virginia, as a state, is core to Southern identity because it was the founding Southern state plus the stronghold of the Confederacy. The name Conrad connotes two relevant figures. Firstly, there is Thomas Nelson Conrad, who is romanticized and mythologized by Southern lost causes as a brave and cunning hero for his daring operations on behalf of the Confederate Secret Service during the American Civil War.
Your Uncle Conrad and Aunt Ginny, were they millionaires?
Secondly, there is of course the author Joseph Conrad. Joseph Conrad's literature, primarily his novel Heart of Darkness, explores the brutalization of Africans by Europeans as its primary theme, concluding that the real darkness to be found in such an arrangement is within the soul of the white Europeans, rather than on the skin of the black Africans. Conrad is referenced to introduce the anti-colonial perspective of his novels into the coded narrative of the Bonnie situation, and to connect the brutalization of Africans in the Belgian Congo with the brutalization of Africans in the southern United States. Jimmy's reluctance to part with his best linens is a metaphor for the South's reluctance to abandon its institutions of slavery, segregation, and white supremacy. Behind Jimmy, we can again see the wallpaper depicting blooming flowers and butterflies that illustrates the idea of renewal. Also, the lamp has a rainbow on it, which is a reference to the Wizard of Oz. In the political allegory that underpins the Wizard of Oz, the rainbow leads to the Emerald City, which symbolises the hollowness and the falseness of political promises. From the perspective of a Southern lost causer, the abandonment of white supremacy is part of a false and hollow political project. The Wizard of Oz is referenced in Butch's chapter. His taxi driver's name, Esmeralda Villalobos, means Emerald City of Wolves. Also, I speculate that Jimmy is Christopher Walken's character's son.
I made it. Major Coolidge, you'd be talking right now to my son, Jim.
Tension between Jules and Vincent arises as they both begin to clean the mess in the car together. Even though Vincent is the one responsible for the mess, he is indignant. Jules shouldn't even really have to help clean Vincent's mess, and he becomes increasingly infuriated as Vincent shirks responsibility, avoids accountability, and distances himself from his own actions. At the moment where their roles become more evenly distributed, Jules mentions things associated with World War II.
Well, I'm a mushroom cloud laying motherfucker. Every time my fingers touch brain, I'm Superfly TNT. I'm the guns of the Navarone.
For a number of reasons, World War II was a catalyst for desegregation. The Guns of Navarone is a World War II movie, and mushroom clouds connote the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan during World War II. Another comparison that Jules uses to describe his rising anger is calling himself Superfly TNT. In this film, a former Harlem drug dealer joins a revolutionary African liberation movement and becomes a politically conscious Pan-Africanist. Jules says that he becomes Superfly TNT whenever he touches brain. If we decipher this sentence, the idea that Jules is communicating is that America's black population, whom he personifies, becomes politically conscious whenever their mind is activated. Also, after the confrontation, Jules says that he shouldn't be in the back. Refusal to sit on the back of buses initiated the civil rights movement.
In fact, what the fuck am I doing in the back?
After Jules and Vincent complete the cleaning of the car, Wolf is impressed, and Jimmy cannot even recognise the interior of the car. However, two historical incidents that demonstrated America's failure to transform its nature following the civil rights era are referenced in the mise-en-scène. Behind Vincent there is a shelf with the board games Kent and Michigan Rummy. In 1970, in what's known as the Kent State shooting, the Ohio National Guard killed a number of white students who were protesting the Vietnam War. Michigan Rummy connotes the Detroit uprising that took place in Michigan as part of a series of race riots that were called the Long Hot Summer. The Detroit uprising was launched in response to police brutality, and overwhelming police brutality defined the events of the unrest. Furthermore, there are hanging chains that allude to the legacy of slavery. The mise-en-scène reminds us that the sanitization process of American history is only superficial. Following the procedure of being hosed down and then provided with dorky clothing, Jules and Vincent are ready to face the world, and the logos of their t-shirts connote the nature of the historical metamorphosis that is being satirized. Vincent has transformed from a post-Puritan New Englander dripping in the ancestral guilt of the historical genocides into a hippie from California, evidenced by his UC Santa Cruz t-shirt. UC Santa Cruz was a hotbed of the hippie counterculture. Jules, having embodied the enraged black population, has become docile. His t-shirt depicts a cartoon character being shot by a policeman. Police brutality and the assassination of political leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were the methods used to contain and demotivate the incensed black population of the 1960s. Tarantino is communicating to us that these socially transformative new identities were provided by Hollywood and that the transformation was superficial. Also, Jules and Vincent are hosed down. The white and black radicals of the 1960s were literally hosed down in order to dampen their explosiveness. Jules tells Jimmy not to leave the soiled clothes out for Otto the garbage man to find.
Don't do nothing stupid like leaving this shit out front for Otto the garbage man to pick up, you know what I'm saying?
This is a reference to the children's story Otto of the Silver Hand, which connects nicely with the coded historical narrative of redemption and distancing oneself from the sins of one's more warlike ancestors. In the book, Otto's mother dies in childbirth as a result of being shocked at the sight of her husband, Baron Conrad, after he returns to the castle wounded from battle. Following her death, Otto's father, Baron Conrad, takes the newborn baby Otto to the nearby monastery to leave him to be raised by monks. Otto eventually returns to live at the castle with his father, and having been raised by gentle monks, the boy is horrified upon learning about his father's violent life as a robber baron. However, like the hippie generation that was sent to Vietnam, Otto becomes involuntarily involved in his father's warfare and he is captured. In captivity, Otto has his hand cut off by his father's rival, meaning that he can never raise a sword. Eventually, Otto grows up to become a peaceful baron, residing in his father's former seat with a hand made of silver. The book is about the emergence of a new, peaceful generation of nobility that thematically correlates with the emergence of the hippie movement, who grew up with the modern mass monastery that is Hollywood and the media more generally. The context of this book also adds depth to the broader message of the Bonnie situation. Otto of the Silver Hand was written by an American author, but it takes place in a European setting, and therefore is an example of the Americanization of the European storytelling tradition, a pattern that has defined Hollywood and its sanitization mission. Disney films especially exemplify the pattern of American cultural production sanitizing and Americanizing European stories like Robin Hood, Peter Pan, Beauty and the Beast, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, and even Hercules, which is extremely sanitized compared to Greek mythology. While Jules and Vincent are being hosed down, Jimmy reminds Wolf to target their hair. For both white and black Americans, hairstyle trends were an important component of the aesthetic transformation that the scene is allegorizing, and these trends were disseminated by media. Wolf and Jimmy mock Jules and Vincent's clothes, even though they were the ones who provided them with the clothes. This dynamic occurs in reality. Hollywood produces, or at least popularizes, fads and subcultures, and then mocks those who participate in those fads and subcultures. Wolf says that in their journey they will go up Hollywood way, just to spell it out.
So a few twists and turns aside, we'll be going up Hollywood way.
The license plate of the car is finally revealed. It is 970. Around 970 AD, the unification of England that began in 937 AD reached its height. Hollywood's nation-building exercise is complete. The one-body aspect of his objective has been accomplished. Wolf's role in the cleaning process is bookended by Americanisms. At the beginning, he said let's get down to brass tacks, and at the end, he says John Q. Law.
Now, if we come across the path of any John Q. laws...
Also, we can see that the no-head aspect of his objective has been achieved. Following a turbulent history, both characters are pacified in their own bespoke ways. They are both behaving in a very laid-back manner in the driveway. They're acting as if they smoked a joint or something. Jules announces that he will not do anything unless Wolf does it first. This line mirrors how contemporary culture in America is imitative and manoeuvred by mass media.
How about you, Lash LaRue?
Wolf calls Vincent Lash LaRue. Lash LaRue was an actor known for his roles in westerns, who spent 10 years as a missionary to repent for his appearance in a cowboy-themed pornographic film called Hard on the Trail. The mention of Lash LaRue evokes the key themes of the Bonnie situation's coded narrative: Hollywood, repentance, and missionaryism. The sins of the past have been washed away by the penitence of the counterculture. Wolf passes the keys of his Acura to Vincent, which symbolises the hippie generation of New Hollywood being granted the role of America's storytellers. However, if the car comes back any different, Monster Joe will be disposing of him too. My hypothesis is that Monster Joe is supposed to connote the monstrous Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism more generally. The anti-communist crusade that was McCarthyism shaped Hollywood so that it became more conformist and thus more uncritical of America's past and present acts of inhumanity. Furthermore, through this defanging of subversive figures, McCarthyism was weaponized against black political expression. Therefore, the name Monster Joe is perhaps intended to suggest that Joe McCarthy's witch hunt consolidated America's role in sanitizing American history. Wolfe explicitly states when the body is disposed of that it is like it never happened.
We cool?
Like it never happened.
America's legacy of genocide and the ancestral guilt associated with it has been disposed of. Monster Joe's phone number makes sense as another reference to Strong's Concordance. 555 simultaneously means disarming and the removal of sins. Through cultural production, Hollywood has disarmed the enraged black population and removed the sins of the white population. 7908 and 7909 refer to bereaved and bereavement respectively. Wolfe tells a dog,
On my way, Rex.
Rex means king, and this line suggests that Hollywood, applying an updated version of the Spanish missionary system, is more powerful than a king. The woman who Wolfe meets there is called Raquel, which is an alternative name for Rachel, a biblical figure. Rachel is synonymous with being deceived and given false promises because of her role in the story of Jacob. Rachel wanted to marry Jacob, but her father gave her older sister, Leah, to Jacob as a wife instead. Like Rachel, modern Americans are promised a happy life by Hollywood, but in reality, this promise is a deception, and, like Rachel did, they must watch someone else enjoying the happiness that was promised to them up on the screen. Wolfe says to Raquel, about Monster Joe's truck and tow, that one day all this will be yours. This line reinforces the concept of the fairy tale endings that Hollywood promises. It sounds like he is talking about a fantasy kingdom being passed down to a princess.
All this will be yours. What, the curtains? No, not the curtains, lad.
So, what's with the outfits? You guys going to a volleyball game or something?
Volleyball is an American cultural product. The sport was invented in Massachusetts in 1895. Volleyball's popularity was spread globally by American mass media as it was associated with California beach culture. Volleyball represents how Hollywood packages and distributes fads, in this case very successfully and sustainingly. Additionally, because volleyball is associated with California even though it was invented in Massachusetts, it connotes the cultural legacy of New England on California. In the Bonnie situation, we have seen the process of post-Puritan New Englanders being superficially transformed into hippies of California.
Where do you live?
Redondo?
Inglewood.
Their homes are in Inglewood and Redondo, respectively. Unofficially, segregation still exists. Inglewood is a famously African-American area of Los Angeles and the site of the Rodney King riots. Redondo is a white hippie town in Santa Monica. Santa Monica herself represents hippie ideals like repentance, piety, and opposition to a dissolute lifestyle. Also, Redondo's history is typical of the Spanish colonization through missionaries that is referenced throughout the Bonnie situation. They are told to keep out of the sticks. This is another Americanism to mean a rural area. Hippies and black people in America are both unwelcome in some rural areas because these areas have been unaffected by the historical process allegorized in this chapter. After Wolfe drives off, Jules and Vincent go to Hawthorne's Grill. This is a reference to Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose literature explores ancestral guilt resulting from America's original sin that was the genocide of Native Americans.
And I'm showing you that there was 2 Holocausts in America. This is one of them. We've dealt with the Indian Holocaust, the Holocaust of the American Indian in America. But we haven't been dealing with the Holocaustic aspects, the Auschwitzian aspects of the slave trade in America.
As I explored in part 1 of this series, at Hawthorne's Grill, Vincent and Jules have an epic confrontation with the old world tyranny that Honey Bunny and Pumpkin represent.
Jules, you give that fucking Nimrod $1,500 and I'll shoot him on general principle.
In part 4, I will be exploring how Mia Wallace and Vincent Vega's chapter, immersed in the tropes of Gothic fiction, provides a coded satire of American society's decadence in the 20th century, while illustrating how the social transformations surrounding the countercultural era are shaped by Hawthornian ancestral guilt.
You can get a steak here, Daddy-O. You can get a steak here, Daddy-O.
Mia Wallace and Vincent Vega's chapter explores the notion that good times produce weak men and that weak men produce bad times.
Marvin, what do you make of all this?
Man, I don't even have an opinion.
Well, you gotta have an opinion. I mean, do you think that God came down from heaven and stopped? Oh,
what the fuck's happening?
Oh, man, shit, man. Oh, man, I shot Marvin in the face.
Why the fuck you do that?
Well, I didn't mean to do it. It was an accident.
Oh, man.